Welcome to the Bronx African American History Project. My name is Steven Payne, librarian and archivist at the Bronx County Historical Society, and I have the pleasure of being here with Melissa Taylor, a longtime Bronxite and resident of the Coops, or United Workers Cooperative Colony, located at 2700 Bronx Park East. So we begin these oral history interviews by asking, Melissa, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and how you all ended up in the Bronx, at least as far as you know.
Okay. So my father's family, I was born in 1959, born in Manhattan, but only lived there for like a day or so, just because I was born in the hospital there.
Sure.
Lived in the Bronx most of my life, except for a few years I lived in Chicago. And all the time I've lived in the Bronx, I have lived in the Coops. My father's family is from Abbeville, South Carolina. He was born in 1913. And I believe in 1916, there was a lynching in their town, which I later found out was a very famous lynching, and which I bet you heard the details of from my cousin when you talked to her.
I did.
And they then moved to Atlanta briefly, and there was some sort of disturbances, race riots, uprisings, something in Atlanta. They left Atlanta. They then moved to Long Island to Old Westbury, Long Island. And I believe from there they moved somewhere in the Bronx and then to the Coops. I'm not 100% sure. It's long before I was born.
Sure.
And so then my father and his sister Angie and his brother Dick and his sister Imogene. I don't know if my Aunt Jean actually lived in the Coops at one point or not, but I do know that Angie and Dick and my father all did.
Sure.
My mother and my grandparents, my grandmother was here too.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Okay.
And I'm not sure about my grandfather. I never met my grandparents. They passed before I was born.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly what the timeline is of who was alive and who was around at the time.
Sure.
My mother was born in Germany, and she was Jewish, and she was growing up in Germany and going to school when Hitler became chancellor. My grandparents both worked in the opera house there. My grandfather was a composer and a conductor and a musician. My grandmother played the harp and she sang in the opera company. And because they were Jewish and because it was considered a government job, when Hitler came to power, they lost their jobs. My mother, they put in laws where they could no longer give her the top grades. She was a really good student, but they couldn't give top grades to Jewish students, and they started reducing her grades. Their neighbors stopped talking to her, and to my grandparents and to her sister, etc. So anyway, by various means, they ended up here. My grandparents and my mother's sister both came to this country. My mother went to Israel, which was then still Palestine. It was not a country yet. It was a British protectorate.
Sure.
And she lived there for a couple of years, and she came to this country to visit her parents and ended up never leaving. And she stayed, and they lived somewhere in the Bronx. And I'm not sure whether she ended up in the Coops because she married my father or if she lived here first. I think maybe she moved here because his family was here. I'm not 100% certain on that.
Okay. I see.
Anyway, that's the way my parents from their various places ended up in this neighborhood.
Sure. Sure.
And then my father had been previously married to a woman named Scotty Huff. And he and Scotty had my sister Lori, who was born, I believe, in 1940. And then they got divorced. She moved away. And then in 1950, my father and my mother got married. They had my sister Sharon in 1952, and then I was born in 1959. So that's the whole history of how I got here, my parents, my siblings.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe, if I remember correctly, your father was in World War II. Is that
He
right?
was in World War II. He was in the Army. He became a major. He was in a couple of, I guess, places in the States. He was in California at one point. He was in Hawaii at one point, and then he was in the Pacific Theater. He was in Australia, and he was in New Guinea.
Oh, I see. I see.
In the Pacific, whatever you call that area.
Sure. Sure.
The South Pacific, the Australia area, the
Yeah,
Antipodes,
yeah.
whatever they call that. But he was in Australia, and he was in New Guinea during World War II, and he and his commanding officer did not get along, and this was the segregated army, and he felt that his commanding officer was a bit of a, what is the word I want to look for? He used to call him Old Handkerchief Head, to give you an idea. He considered him a bit of an Uncle Tom. And anyway, but they didn't like each other,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, yeah.
And so he served under this guy, and there were a couple of times when he could have come home early. There was a mission, and they said anybody who volunteered for this mission, assuming you lived through it, you would get to go home early with an honorable discharge. And he volunteered, and his CO, since he didn't like my father, wouldn't allow him. And it ended up, I think it was Guadalcanal. It was something where like hundreds of people died.
Oh,
So basically his life was spared because this commander did not care for him and wouldn't give him what was considered a juicy assignment.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, but that's the story. And then he came home, and he became he was a printer. He worked in a printing press. And then from there, he became a union organizer for the printers. He was
Oh,
in District 65, which was, I don't remember what part of what union they were. Later on, they joined up with the Teamsters, the auto workers. But it was called District 65 of, I don't remember what.
sure.
And he became an organizer, and they organized printers, people who worked in department stores, like people who were in all kinds of like direct mail and distribution stuff that was their area. And that's what he did.
Yeah.
And he was very involved in the, progressive politics. If I'm not mistaken, my father was in the Communist Party. My mother was not. And my mother would always tell me, I was never a communist, I was a socialist. And we're like, yeah, Mom, you know what? They were still tapping your phone too. So,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
you
In
know,
their eyes,
it didn't really matter to the FBI, to the
yeah,
cops, or anybody else. But I mean, I know that from childhood, our phone was tapped.
yeah.
People had us under surveillance. There's a family story, if I can just go off on a family story.
Absolutely. This
Okay.
is great. Yeah.
So here's the story. I was a very precocious kid. I learned to read really young. And my mother says 2 3/4. Now, I've been looking at some stuff. I might have been 3,
Yeah.
but I was young. I wasn't in school yet. I was in like a stroller. And we were picketing because we were very involved, obviously, in picketing, civil rights stuff,
Sure.
all those things, all those movements. And there's a White Castle on Boston Road, Allerton Avenue. You're familiar with it?
I've seen the
And
photos
you've
of,
seen the photos. Okay, so
yeah.
back in
I
whatever,
mean,
the
I'm
early
familiar.
60s. Well, it's still there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So I've seen it today, but I've seen the photos and yeah. Anyway, of some of the protest and
Right. So
all the local KKK worshipers came out, of course,
exactly. So I
Yeah.
was like a small child at the time, and I was in the stroller, and my mother and her friend Stella, and whatever Stella's kids, she had kids who were more or less my contemporaries, and we were walking this picket line, and then Sharon might have been there too. I don't know. She was probably in school, and we were picketing them because they would only hire white workers.
Yeah.
They wouldn't hire anybody who wasn't white. So we were walking around, and according to family legend, the first full sentence I read on my own from the stroller was, "Police line, do not cross." So there you go, my radical toddlerhood. There's a place, it's not there anymore, but there used to be a restaurant called Gina's that was across the street, right on the, it's not Matthews Avenue, I don't remember, but whatever street that is, right there on the one side of, just to the west of White Castle. It's
Sure.
an Italian restaurant, which we did not go to for years. Years later, we were like, well, maybe we could patronize them again. But the patrons of this restaurant would come out. They'd be sitting in the bar drinking or sitting in the restaurant eating. They came out and they threw rocks at us.
Oh my God.
And then they went back and they stayed in the restaurant. So we had liked that place before we stopped going, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know what the point of that story was, except that I was on the picket line from, early childhood.
Yeah, yeah.
And, oh, I know what the point of this was. So when we were doing this picketing, my mother was a very friendly, outgoing person. She would talk to everybody,
Yeah.
much to my embarrassment a lot of the time. And she started talking to this guy, this young man. And he seemed like a nice person. He wasn't from the area. He didn't really know many people and whatever. And she felt bad for him. And she let him come to our house, and he ended up staying with us for a while because he had no
Okay.
place to go.
Yeah, yeah.
And she used to cook for him, and she said, oh, he had bad teeth, so she used to cook him like soft foods, like scrambled eggs, and she would go out of her way. And when he left, he was there for, I don't know, a week or something. But when he left this briefcase behind, and they were trying to locate him. They couldn't locate him. They're like, my father was like, well, let's open the briefcase and maybe it'll have some address or phone number or something. We can figure out how to forward this to this person.
Sure.
And it turned out he was working for the CIA, which, by the way, if people tell you the CIA only gets involved in foreign organizations,
No way.
it's not true. I know this from my personal experience and my childhood. So apparently he was carrying on surveillance operations on all our neighbors from our house.
Wow.
So it became like a family joke. If mom says somebody's a nice young man, just run. Do not invite him to your house, because apparently she's a really poor judge of character, because this person will come to your house and give the government information about you. But we had our phone tapped.
Yeah, for sure.
Stuff like that, for sure.
I'm sure your mother and father had their own individual FBI agents assigned to them even.
Oh, I keep thinking I should do a Freedom of Information Act thing and see if there's a dossier. For all I know, there's a dossier on me from when I was a baby. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows what they consider suspicious in a 3-year-old?
I mean, you were the child of notorious black communist and a socialist.
Exactly. I mean, I know my father, I know you're familiar with the Red Squad that was in the New York Police Department.
Yeah.
And they used to send people to his meetings, to his union meetings. And my father, being my father, there was some guy, I don't remember the person's name. It was like, lieutenant, whoever. It was like some kind of higher ranked than a regular police officer guy. And, my father recognized him at union meeting and other meetings. And so my father would be introducing people, starting a meeting, and say, oh, and we're very honored to have Lieutenant so-and-so from the New York Police Department. Would you stand up, sir, so everybody can see you? And they didn't like that. But I mean, they were infiltrating all that
Absolutely.
stuff, all that stuff. I mean, not just the political meetings, the union meetings, of course, always.
Absolutely. And your mother was if I remember correctly, at least from other conversation I had, she was a concert pianist her whole life?
No, she was a singer. She was a singer. She was
oh, that's right. Okay.
Opera singer mostly.
Opera singer.
And
That's right.
in terms of like teaching and other performances, also like folk singer kind of.
Sure. Would you all go down to like the folk concerts, I think Friday nights? Maybe this was before your time.
I don't remember. I think all that stuff that was going on in the basement was before my time, except for the art classes with oh, come on, I was friends with her daughter, Nina Edelstein, who used to teach like painting and sketching. So I took art classes with her. I went to school with her daughter. I'm sorry, her name was Nancy. Was her name Nancy? Or was the kid's name Nancy? I get confused.
Sure.
But the daughter I went to school with was around my age, and the mother was an artist, and she used to teach art classes in the basement of the Coops. And I remember drawing faces and her explaining like proportions of the face.
Yeah.
But aside from that, all that other stuff, all the like the Yiddish lessons and the concerts and all that stuff, I don't remember doing any of that stuff.
Yeah.
I think I'm too young.
Yeah. Was the library still around?
The library was still there when I was a child, definitely. And it was when whatever landlord it was took over and they started doing the renovations and clearing stuff out, that all those books went out. And I am not 100% sure where they ended up.
Yeah.
But they cleared everything out of the basements at that point.
Wow.
And I guess I was an adult at that point. I don't remember exactly what year it was. This would have
Sure.
been maybe in the 80s,
I see.
maybe.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
100% certain.
You know,
But I
it's
mean, the library was there, but I
no
don't
one
really
really,
remember using it. And I think a lot of it was in Yiddish anyway, which I don't speak.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, 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 for sure, for sure. I mean, um, yeah, I don't know. I'm one of the things I am trying to do is trying to figure out what happened to the books, but I found, uh, you know, one thing that had the library stamp on it that
mm,
surfaced on Abe Books, and so I
mhm,
bought it uh,
right.
to include in a collection here that I'm building on the Coops. But yeah, that's the only trace I found of it so far. It's an
There
English.
was some organization, I don't know if it was YIVO or one of those that was going around and getting books from a lot of libraries. And
Yeah, maybe
I'm
the
not
Yiddish Book
sure.
Center. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, I need to ask them if they have any traces. But anyway,
There was a documentary I saw. Gosh, I wish I could remember what it was, but it had to do with people recovering books, and
mm,
especially books in Yiddish. And gosh, if I can remember what it is, I will pass along the information, but don't count on it.
yeah, yeah.
It was just like something I saw in passing,
Sure,
and anyway.
sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, we'll see. But I hope at least a large part of the books were somehow salvaged. I mean, but who knows right now? Um, but yeah. So, uh, just to get away from the coops for just a second, although I
Mhm.
imagine you'll probably touch on them still in some of these questions. Do you remember the specific elementary school you went to when you're
Yeah, I went to PS 96 on
yes 96?
Mesa Avenue. Mesa
Yeah,
Avenue, I think it is.
yeah, yeah.
And then I went to 135, which was just up the street to junior high school, and then I went to Bronx Science for
You
high
went to
school.
Bronx Science. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what was your experience like in the New York public schools at the time?
I am one of these people who has terrible memories, not terrible memories like I had a bad childhood. Like I don't remember a
Oh,
lot of
sure,
stuff from
sure.
my childhood, and I don't know why that is.
I'm
Because
that way a little too. So
usually, people say like, "Oh, did you have a terrible trauma?" It's like, no, oh, not that I remember.
could be, who knows?
But could be. Um, I don't know. I went to elementary school young,
Yeah.
because partially I think because I was driving my mother crazy, because I was like too running around and too talkative and too like energetic and for an adult to put up with. But also I was reading and stuff, so
Sure.
I was born in December, and I think the rule for public schools is you had to be born September or earlier to go into a grade,
Mm,
and they put me in anyway because
wow.
whatever. So I went to kindergarten, which I don't remember at all. Then I went to first grade, and then my teacher was Mrs. Provenza at the time, who later married somebody named Bass, but whose son grew up to be rather famous, and who I have a real animus against from childhood, but let's not go into that. He was very, very mean to me when we were children. But she was a great teacher, and I don't remember all my teachers that well, but I do remember, like in first grade, since I was already reading, the kids were in reading groups, and based on their level of skill or whatever. And I was in my own separate group. I was in a separate group, and there was another child, another little boy, who was in a separate group,
Oh,
and I
wow.
was supposed to help the other children with their reading, which, being a rather shy person,
Yeah.
was a terrible thing. And also I was the youngest person in the class,
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
I did not like being in a position of having any kind of authority or making suggestions to people who were older than I was.
Sure.
So it wasn't a good thing for me. But I mean, I don't remember all that much of it. Oh, I can tell you about a racist administrator.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Do tell. Yeah.
So there was this lady, she was the assistant principal. I do not remember her last name. I was talking to one of my friends, actually, who
Yeah.
also is a Koopnik and a little older, and we couldn't come to an agreement on what this person's name was. But my mother was, at least one or two of the years, the president of the Parents Association. And
Mm,
she was very involved in the Parents Association, and she was really involved with the kids and the teachers and all the school stuff and the activities. So, which is largely where she was interacting with Brenda, who you mentioned.
sure.
Um, so I'm sorry, somebody's sleeping in the room with me. You okay, hon? Okay. So there was the assistant principal. I don't remember her last name. I don't want to slander somebody. I think her first name was Gertrude. I don't remember the last name.
Yeah, yeah,
And this woman was, she was mean.
yeah.
And I guess, I don't think she liked children. I don't know why she was in a position working with young kids, but I'll give you some examples. I don't remember everything she said and whatever, but again, like, I was little. This was when I was like maybe first, second grade, whatever
Sure.
this happened. And I would hear these conversations. My mother would say, "You better not repeat this. You know that this is adult conversation. This has nothing to do with you. Do not repeat it to your classmates. Do not repeat it to your teachers. These are secret. I can't help it if you overhear me when I'm on the phone or there's somebody in the house, but keep it to yourself." Anyway, for example, there was a little boy. This is not the racist part, but this is the mean and shouldn't have been working with children part.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
was a little boy. He was a first grade kid. And there's a big apartment building right across the street from the school. And he lived in that building. And he was little and he started missing his mother. He wanted to go home for lunch. And she told him, "You can't go home for lunch because you're signed up for lunch here." And which was probably the rule. That's fine. I mean, you can't just send the kid home in the middle of the day. But he was getting visibly really upset. And she told him, this little like 6-year-old child, "If you don't stop crying, I'm going to call a policeman and he's going to come take you and put you in jail."
Oh my God.
Which of course didn't make him cry any less. So that was one example. But then here's the other thing. And this is what made my mother, I believe, go and contact the Board of Education. And this woman ended up getting taken out of her job at school. They had a hearing. Of course, she just got a job at what was then Livingston Street in the Board of Education, but she was taken out of direct contact with kids.
Yeah.
Um, there was a little boy, a little Puerto Rican boy, and he went to his teacher and he said, whatever the teacher's name was, "What's an electric chair?" And the teacher said, "Why are you asking me that?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, well, Miss So-and-so said, I'm going to end, is it like an electric blanket?" She says, "Well, tell me why you're asking." She says, "Well, Miss So-and-so said, I'm going to end up in the electric chair like all of my people."
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Wow.
when my mother heard about that, they contacted the Board of Education and, started proceedings
Yeah.
against this lady. But anyway, so that she was the assistant principal when I was
Same.
little. I mean, I didn't really have any dealings with her,
Sure.
but obviously it's not the best person to have in an environment with
Absolutely not. What
little
about any of
kids.
your specific teachers in elementary or
I,
junior high or high
I
school?
wish I could tell you that I remember them really well.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of my experience of race has been, um, I recognized at some point in my childhood is that people, when they look at me, do not necessarily perceive me as Black
Yeah.
because I'm mixed, and because not just because I'm mixed, but because of the type of features and coloring and stuff that I have. And
Sure.
I have spent my life being taken for being Latina,
Yeah.
which brings its own prejudices that I've encountered,
Yeah.
which brings its own, being followed around in stores and people assuming I'm on welfare, which was a big thing when I was a kid.
Mm,
Somebody asked me once, some man, I was walking my mother's dogs, and he said to me, "Oh, they let you have dogs when you're on relief? That's nice." And I was like, "What?" First
God.
of all, you can tell this is one of these old depression people saying relief rather than welfare, but I mean, I knew that's why that was. I
Yeah.
mean, I knew that was, at that time, that was kind of the social structure. I mean, I think as much as there was racism, I think Black people were assumed to be working and Latin people were assumed to be on welfare.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was the perception, like in the 60s in New York.
Sure.
But I had a teacher who was one of my favorite teachers in junior high school. And it's like, like people say things to you sometimes and it doesn't always click, like, wait a minute, that's a really messed up thing for somebody to have said, like you don't put it in the context and go, wait a minute, was that a racist thing that person said to me?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
especially when it's somebody that you think you want to think well of.
Sure.
So I had a teacher in junior high school. He was my homeroom teacher, my algebra teacher, ninth grade. And we were talking like at the end of the year because I was one of the higher performing students in that class, apparently. And he said to me, oh, you know, when I met you, when I saw you come in the classroom, I thought you didn't look like a good student. And it didn't occur to me until like a couple of years later. It's like, wait a minute, what does he mean I don't look like a good
Yeah.
student?
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
But then I said, oh, I get it.
Yep.
You know, I
Yep.
get it.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, I didn't encounter a lot of overt
Sure.
stuff from my teachers that I remember.
Sure. Sure.
But
Sure.
that sure was.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm sure it's one of those things where, you know, if he were pressed on it, he would have tried to say, oh, that's not what I meant. But, you know,
Exactly.
language
It
is
was that
more
blouse she was
truthful.
wearing.
Yeah. Language is more truthful than intention sometimes. Um, but, uh, um, but yeah, so were you in uh, any kind of extracurricular activities in Bronx High School of Science
Um,
that you remember?
I don't, you know, I really wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just like went to class and hung out with my friends, and that was basically it. I mean,
Sure.
I came from a family where my immediate family anywhere where I kind of like went to school and came home and spent a lot of time with my sister and with my mother, and not a lot of time outside the house with outside people
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
which I realize now is kind of unusual, but it probably has a lot to do with my particular my mother's personality and her mental state.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
she had
Sure.
some mental issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just kind of, it's just, I guess, with just the approach of my parents. So
For
yeah, I don't
sure.
remember being in any particular like clubs or anything like that when I was in high school, which is kind of weird. I mean,
Yeah.
I was in the band, but I mean, that was a school thing, you
Sure.
know, like
Sure.
class time thing,
Ah.
really.
Okay. Okay. What instrument did you play?
French horn.
And at that point, uh, had
But I mean, we didn't have concerts and stuff. It was just,
yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Were you able to bring the instrument home at that point, or had that already?
Oh yeah, no. Well,
Okay.
my sister Sharon had played the French horn in school,
Oh,
so
I see. I see.
we had one. We owned one.
Ah,
She
you
had,
owned one. Okay.
she had private lessons at some point, so we
Yeah.
owned one. Well, what happened was when I was in junior high school, they first put me in the orchestra class, which was the
Mm.
string instrument class, and my mother went and complained. Well, first of all, we owned a French horn, so she really wanted me to put in the brass class because we already had an instrument for one
Sure.
thing.
Sure.
But she was like, my father played the violin, and you know, I know what it sounds like when somebody can play the violin. And if you think I'm going to be with a beginning violin or viola student in my house and put up with that, blah, blah, blah. So she got me switched to the band class.
Uh,
Yeah, my mother was a character.
oh yeah, I know. A lot of mothers are. Mine is a lot.
She was quite a character. But
Yeah.
you know, she didn't want to put up with somebody scratching away on a fiddle. So
Sure. Sure. And um, I guess already by the time you were in elementary and junior and high school, uh, there were uh, plenty of Black and Puerto Rican students at your schools, right?
I had about plenty.
Oh, not plenty,
I think it was. I would say it was predominantly white, but
predominantly
yeah, I
white.
mean, but there were some. Yeah,
Sure. Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Um,
Actually, I learned. I mean, as far as the high school goes, it's interesting because my cousin Charlotte had said to me at one point that one of the reasons that she didn't take the test to go to science was she says there weren't that many of us. But
yeah.
if you look now at the statistics of the demographics of the science schools um, in New York, if you look at Bronx Science, Stuyvesant, and Brooklyn Tech, the percentage of students of color is much lower now than it was when I was in high school.
That's
I think when I was
crazy.
in high school, I think the Black and Latin students was maybe like 10% or maybe even a little more than that. And now
Yeah.
it's what, 5 or something?
Yeah.
It's ridiculously low. So
Oh,
there were more of us then
than there are now.
than there are now. I mean,
It's
I felt
crazy.
like it was, you know, largely white, good representation of Asian students,
Mm,
but still, it wasn't like there was nobody.
sure.
Like
Sure.
there were some of us there.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't feel like I was like a tiny, tiny, tiny minority.
Yeah. And
You
that was
know,
at your
and
elementary.
now it is.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy. That was at your
It is
elementary and
crazy.
junior high too.
Junior high, again, mostly white kids.
Sure.
Mostly white kids, and probably mostly, I would say probably mostly like Jewish kids and Italian kids.
Yeah, yeah.
It being the Bronx and it being this area in the Bronx, yeah.
Yeah. And so you mentioned of course, White Castle already, but do you remember instances of other uh, white people in the general neighborhood, uh, you know, eh, doing anything that intimidated you or anything along those lines?
I don't remember anything like that.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I remember me personally. No, I know that my sister Sharon, who was 7 years my senior, encountered. Okay, bear in mind that she's very, very fair complected, and a lot of people thought
Mm,
she was white. White people thought she was white.
yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, it depends on what eye you have.
Sure, sure.
Those of us who are not white could look at her and say, "Oh yeah, I can see, you know, your features, your bone structure, your
Yeah,
whatever, your extremely curly hair."
yeah,
Um, but but she encountered, I think, more anti-Semitism than
um,
anti-Black kind of prejudice. And
sure.
she had like some Italian American kid telling her, you know, the Jews killed Jesus. And she told my mother that, and my mother, who actually lived in Palestine and
Yeah.
actually has read scriptures and stuff and is interested in history, said to her, "You go back and you tell her, no, that was the Romans, that was her people." And she also, she encountered something else, some racist something from some Italian kid, and
Yeah.
my mother said, "Well, you know," my mother said, "Well, you know, if you think that when Hannibal came over the Alps, you know, everybody was just untouched and whatever, you don't think any intermixing went on there?" My mother was big on saying things like that to
That's
people.
funny.
But
Oh,
anyway, I mean, I honestly, I don't recall encountering a lot of that stuff. And as I said, what I did encounter, honest to God, my whole life, people look at me and they think I'm Puerto Rican. And so,
yeah.
I mean, I did encounter racism, but it wasn't racism for the group I really belonged to,
Sure, sure. Yeah.
largely,
Yeah, yeah.
largely.
Um, and uh and yeah, what about oh yeah, were there areas of the Bronx that you would avoid or that you knew to avoid or anything along those lines?
Not really, because as I said, you know, I wasn't really such an adventurous person who was going off to
Sure.
different areas, and I kind of learned about some of them after later, later on.
Yeah, yeah.
And as far as the Bronx went, not so much.
Yeah.
Excuse me. As an adult, as a young adult, I had some friends who lived in Brooklyn, and they wanted to go to a restaurant out there. They wanted to go to Randazzo's, and my father was like, "You're not going there. You're
Mm,
not going there because they don't want you there.
mm,
Do not go there, because if you
yeah,
go there, you will have trouble."
yeah, yeah.
But I mean, I don't remember any particular areas in the Bronx or whatever that were
Sure.
in that category.
Sure, sure. I mean, I guess especially by the time you would have been old enough to venture around, there were fewer and fewer, lily white pockets in the Bronx to begin with. Um,
Hmm.
but there were still a few, of course. I mean, you live right on the edge of one pretty white neighborhood, of course. Um, but yeah,
But I mean, I wasn't like hanging out in those
sure,
places, you
absolutely.
know.
Yeah, no reason to. Um, I mean, at that point, I guess you still had pretty much everything you needed within a few blocks of the Coops. Is that
Hmm.
all right? I mean, was there still a movie theater at the
Oh
time?
yeah, I
Yeah,
used to go to the Allerton Theater all the time when I was
Allerton
a kid.
Theater. Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. And
And there was also the Globe on Pelham Parkway that we
oh,
used to
okay.
go to, and then we would occasionally go to, was it the Valentine over near Fordham Road?
Mm,
But yeah, there was a movie theater just a couple of blocks up the street.
sure, sure. And would you hang out in Bronx Park very much when you were
Yeah,
growing
and we excuse me, and we at a certain point we had dogs, so I was always in there walking the dogs.
up? Yeah. What kind of dogs did you have?
Oh, various mixed breed dogs,
Sure, sure.
you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Excuse me.
Mhm. And let's see. Oh, okay, yeah. So, a couple other general questions before we get to the specific Coops ones. Um, obviously music was a big part of your household growing up. Do you remember particular musicians or genres that your family listened to more often than not?
Of all the weird things, my father, of all the weird things, my father loved Gilbert and Sullivan. It's such a bizarre thing. I mean, for somebody who was like not just a Black man and not just an American, but somebody who was really committed to like civil rights and
Yeah,
stuff like that. He loved Gilbert and Sullivan. He loved Rudyard Kipling. It was like, Kipling, like that colonialist,
I know.
imperialist guy, really? I mean, but he liked his poetry. I
Yeah.
don't know, kind of weird. We had a lot of opera in the house. We had a lot of folk music in the house. I mean, that's coming from my parents. Um, my mother had no tolerance for popular music generally at
Mm,
all. And
mm,
of course, my sister, who was born in 1952, she was just the age for like the British invasion, the Beatles, and all that stuff.
yeah,
And, whatever was popular at the time, like Motown kind of stuff and
sure.
whatever. But there was like a ton of mostly classical music. And my father really liked classical music
I,
too.
yeah, yeah.
And he really liked Wagner too. So go figure. It's so bizarre.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
that culturally kind of weird. Not that it's not great music, but
Sure,
of
sure.
all
But
the
yeah,
things,
for
really.
yeah, 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 absolutely.
Um,
I understand.
and my mother, not that it was like necessarily her music of choice, but my mother used to sing on WEVD, which you've heard of WEVD,
Yeah.
the station that speaks your language. And she used to be on the Forward Hour, which, the Forward, the newspaper at that time was very much a progressive newspaper.
Yeah.
And WEVD was actually named after Eugene Debs.
That's right. I remember hearing that
Debs.
somewhere, reading that somewhere.
And
Yeah.
my mother used to sing on the Forward Hour. So, basically she could sing anything she wanted to if it was translated into Yiddish.
Yeah.
So, and my mother did not speak Yiddish. My mother spoke German and she spoke English and she spoke Hebrew. And she had the disdain of a lot of German Jews for Yiddish because,
Mm,
they just, my grandfather like tried and he was like, this language doesn't make any sense. But she used to translate like operatic arias into Yiddish. And so she could get to sing like in her genre that she
yeah,
liked
yeah.
and she was trained for, which
Wow,
is kind of funny.
that's
But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of music, but I would think that like the kind of popular stuff that my sister and I were tending to listen to, my mother was very disdainful of. Did not share in it. Oh, and a fair amount of like popular standards and jazz. I mean, my father, before he was married to my mother, and before he was married to his first wife, even was engaged to a woman who I think her name was Rachel, who was a dancer,
mm.
and she danced at the Apollo.
Oh wow,
And
yeah,
she was one of the people who, when Ella Fitzgerald came there and won the talent show the first time,
yeah.
she had to, come back the next week to defend her title, and she didn't have another gown to wear. And all the chorus girls chipped in and bought her a dress, and that was my father's fiance
Wow,
at the time. But I mean, the kind of that style of music was
sure,
around too, because my
sure,
parents were
sure.
older, also,
Yeah.
than a lot of my contemporaries' parents.
Oh yeah, yeah. I bet. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Do you remember your parents ever going to any of the jazz clubs in the Bronx or ever speaking about that?
No, mm-mm.
Okay, yeah. I mean, probably by the time you were a child and teenager, a lot of them had disappeared. But
It wouldn't have been my mother's thing, probably.
yeah,
She when she came to this country, she was touring. It was like young Palestinian artists, something or
mm,
other. And she talked about like singing and being booked into a place that was like a nightclub, and people were talking over her when she was singing. People were smoking, which was very bad for her throat, and she
yeah,
didn't really like that setting at all. So I
sure.
suspect that if there was any going to clubs by my father, it was before he married my mother.
I see.
I
I
don't
see.
know, maybe with his first wife, maybe when he was divorced and before he got married again,
Yeah, yeah. I
and
think
that sort of thing.
so. I'm guessing probably. Uh, your father and Angie and all the siblings lived pretty close before they moved into the Coops. And I know I've seen an address for Angie like around 161st Street before she moved into the
Yeah,
Coops.
I'm not sure where, but they were someplace else in the Bronx originally, for
Yeah,
sure.
so if your dad lived close to where Angie lived, like in the, I think it was in 1938, I saw that address. Then there were some clubs around there, so he might have gone to them, but who knows
It's
at this
quite possible. I
point.
mean,
Yeah,
I don't know. He never really discussed it with me. I know that,
sure.
you know, he would mention like musicians and stuff. He mentioned that like he had met Fats Waller. He had been in his house and
Oh wow.
stuff like that. But that was not in the Bronx. That was in Manhattan. That was in Harlem.
Yeah. For
But, you know, I remember we were driving down the street one day in Manhattan and he was like, oh yeah, Fats Waller used to live on this block. And, you know, if you went in his house, as soon as if there were like more than two people, he considered it an audience and he would like get a glass of whiskey and put it on the organ and start playing. So,
sure. Wow. Yeah.
but I
Um,
mean, I don't remember him ever talking about like nightclubs or concerts
sure.
or anything like that. They used to go down to concerts occasionally, probably more classical stuff,
Yeah.
like at Lewiston Stadium at City College, which
Okay.
no
Yeah.
longer exists. But there was, I don't know if you know, but there was a big stadium at right near City College, and no kidding, and uh, they would go to things there. But
Sure.
I don't really recall any other. As I said, you know, that whole like nightclub thing was not my mom's thing, so I doubt they did a lot of that.
Yeah.
You know, concerts by people like they knew like folk kind of things and classical kind of things, yeah.
Paul
And
Robeson, they uh, ever listen to or go to any Paul Robeson concerts? There only would have been a handful
oh,
by
Paul
the beginning.
Robeson. Now
Yeah.
here's a family story. The
Oh yeah.
famous
Let's hear
Paul
it.
Robeson concert in Peekskill. My
Ah.
father was one of the people working security at that.
Aha. Yep.
So yeah, he was there. My mother was not there, I don't think. But
Wow.
my father, yeah, so he was one of the people who was trying to get the bus and everything in and out safely.
Was he? Do you remember if he was at both? Because they tried to do it the first time, and they successfully did it the second time, like a week
I
later.
don't know. I only heard about one. I got the impression it was an outdoor thing. Was it in a theater?
No, it was outdoor. The first time, the racist blocked the road, so it was
Hmm.
only maybe like a dozen people who got to the concert. The second time, they blocked the road again, but a lot more people got to the concert before they did so. And
It might have been the one because he talked about like after the show. So it must have been that must have been that
yeah,
one. I
but
don't know about the first one. He might have been there as well. I don't know.
Paul
I used
Robeson
to
didn't
go
even
along.
get to the first one.
Would you say that again?
Paul Robeson didn't even make it to the
Oh, he
first
didn't even make it to the first
one.
one.
No. That's why the people who organized it said, well, we got to do it again because we won't be intimidated. Um,
Right.
and
Or you don't even have your performer, right?
yeah, they did it again, but God, yeah, that's another wild series of photographs to see for sure. But um, do you remember? Do you remember if Paul Robeson ever came around the Coops by the time you were a
Not to,
child?
not that I'm aware of, no.
Yeah, um, it must have been probably in the early 50s because Charlotte remembers being carried around like on his shoulders. So
Hmm.
I think by the time you were a child, he was probably, well, I know he was in the Soviet Union for a while, uh,
Right,
but he his career had also pretty much been ended by the FBI and by
right.
communist hysteria and all of that.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, now going to the Coop specifically, uh, where in the Coops did you all live, and did you all move around in the Coops at all?
Yeah. Okay. So when I was little, we lived in the first court in the A building. I think the
Mm,
apartment was A52. We're on the top floor of the A
top
building.
floor, yeah.
And then we moved to I don't know how old I was, maybe junior high-ish age, somewhere between like 10 and 12, something like that.
Yeah.
We moved to J in the second court. And then when my Aunt Angie, Charlotte's mother, passed, we moved into her old apartment in the H building in the
Sure.
first court. And then my sister Lori had been living in she'd been living in Manhattan, and then she was living in California. She was living in Northern California first, where Charlotte was.
Mm.
And then she was going to college in Irvine in Southern California. And then when she moved back, she moved into the apartment I live in now, which is in the U building in the third court. And when I moved out from my parents' house, I lived in S in the first court, and my sister Sharon lived in V in the first court. And yeah, that's basically it. And then I was back with my mom for a while, and then I moved to Chicago and came back. Was staying with a friend in E in the first court, and now we're living in U in the third court.
Yeah. And
so yes, that covers everything, I think.
Yeah. Were your parents on the top floor the whole time?
No, I mean, when I was little, we were on the top floor, and then we lived on the third floor in J, and then when we moved to Angie's apartment, that was the first floor. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. One thing that has come up in, interviews with a couple of the older Koopniks is they remember pretty much all the Black families except Angie being on the top floor. I don't
Really?
know
I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I guess it would have been, so there were, I don't know, maybe about a dozen, maybe about 20 Black families that moved in 19.
But I'm trying to think, like my Uncle Dick, my father's brother and sister-in-law, Uncle Dick and Aunt Jean, they lived, I don't think they were on the top floor. They were, and I can't remember what building that is.
Yeah.
I can visualize it, but I can't remember what letter. But they lived, I want to say on the third or fourth floor. I'm trying to remember going up to their apartment. Third floor, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't think it was the fifth floor.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I could be wrong.
I imagine it was beginning to change already by the time that more Black families started to move in the 40s because it was such a small amount in 1935.
Absolutely, yeah.
Black families were invited in, but do you remember about when your family moved into the Coops? I mean, obviously you weren't born.
Right. I don't know, honestly. As I said, my father lived on Long Island when he was in high school. I know that. So it wouldn't have been at that point, but I don't know how soon after that they moved to the Bronx. And
Sure.
as you said, they lived elsewhere in the Bronx before they moved to the Coop. So
yeah,
honestly, it's something I'm not aware. I know that my mother and father got married in 1950, and that they lived in the Coops from that point on. So
okay.
I'm guessing my father was here before then.
Yeah.
My father and his siblings. I still don't know whether Imogene ever lived here or not, honestly.
Yeah.
Maybe, actually, she probably lived with her parents or at least with her mother because she was the youngest child. So she probably did at some point. But she ended up, she had a house in Queens in Springfield Gardens. She bought a house.
Oh, I see, yeah.
And that's where she lived when I was growing up. We used to go out to her house in Queens.
Yeah. And so you've already mentioned, of course, your father's brothers and of course sisters and parent, I guess, who lived in the Coops.
Yeah, I have no idea when my grandfather died. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I've heard mention of my grandmother, but I haven't heard anybody say anything about my grandfather when he lived here. So maybe he never did. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I haven't seen that either in what I've come across. I saw it. I don't remember if it was 1946, 1947, but I did find mention of when your grandmother passed because some Koopniks like took out a condolence thing in a newspaper for
really?
For Angie anyway. But that's all I've seen so far. So I imagine your grandfather must have been
before then.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, were you friends with other Koopniks when you were growing up, or you pretty much just stayed with your family?
I pretty much stayed with my family. I mean, I think my sister Sharon was more friends with like kids in the Coops. Like she and Corolla were good friends, for example. I wish I could say I remember. My memory is really weak on that stuff. I mean, my best friend lived in the projects across the street. Her name
Sure,
was
sure.
Sheila Grossman.
Like
Um,
Grossman.
and she lived across the street, and not across the street, but up the street.
Yeah.
And I was friends with another kid who lived in the projects across the street.
Ah,
And
okay. Yeah, yeah.
uh, I guess I was friends with, see, this is terrible because I don't remember who was the mother's name and the daughter's name, but actually, I don't think they lived in the Coops. And we were friends with, my mother had a friend named Stella Mewey.
Mm,
Um, Stella was, Stella was from St. Vincent, and she was a teacher, but she didn't live, I don't think she lived in the Coops. I mean, they were involved in a lot of political stuff together, and she had kids who were more or less my contemporaries. She had a daughter who was younger and a son who was older and a son who was pretty much my age,
sure.
Peter. And I was friends with Peter, but they lived on, I don't think they ever lived in the Coops. I think they lived in Bronx Park East, like a couple of blocks down. They lived in a house there.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
And the same woman, the Edelstein family, the mother was the art teacher. She lived in the same house with them. It was like a two-family house. She lived
Okay.
downstairs and they lived upstairs. So I used to hang out with her son a lot. And then we had other friends. Oh, so stupid. My best friend, Danny Simon, uh, the Simon family, they had, I think, 4 kids.
Mm,
And Danny was like my best friend from like early childhood, like from we were like 4 years old, and
yeah.
then we ended up being in high school together. So, you're right, there weren't that many black families. These are white kids, and then Peter Mooney was half. He was mixed. His mother was black, and his father was from, I want to say, Taiwan.
Okay, I see.
He was
Yeah,
ethnically Chinese, but I'm not sure where
sure.
they were from. I think he was Taiwanese.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, but they didn't live in the Coops.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So what was it like being one of the handful of black families in the Coops?
And this is where my memory is just not that useful. How it affected me personally, I can't tell. I know my mother was very concerned that I didn't have more black friends, and there was
Yeah.
one little girl that I went to elementary school, and she was like, "Oh, you should be friends with her. She's a nice kid. She's a smart kid." She did not like me, this kid. So
You
it was
can't
kind of
force
a thing
friendship.
because my mother was always pushing, like, here is this nice black girl, and she's very intelligent, and blah blah blah, and you should be friends with her but she hated me. So it was kind of a weird thing because I was trying to be an obedient child,
Yeah, yeah,
um, but we didn't. I can't even say we didn't get along. She just really didn't like me, and I don't know why. I don't know
yeah,
why, honestly.
yeah,
But kids, who
for
the
sure.
heck knows? I know that. Anyway, so I don't really have like a sense in my memory of
Sure.
a lot of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, did you do you remember about when the balance started to shift and more of the white families started to move out?
I don't remember exactly when that was.
Yeah,
It's weird. I mean, I guess I wasn't really tuned into people who were older than I was and
sure,
kind of
sure.
their
That,
motivations and what was going on.
yeah, yeah.
Like we had good friends who lived in the area um, who lived in the Coops, and that my sister Sharon was really good friends with their daughter. I mean, I'm still friends with her daughter. And they bought a house and they moved up the street to Yates Avenue. Um, they were a white family. Well, their daughter was half Mexican,
Okay,
but
see.
they from the mother's first marriage.
Sure.
But they were like a white Jewish family, and they were old school Koopniks. The
Okay. Yeah.
grandmother was still living in the Coops. This is if you ever come across them. I'm sure you came across them in the movie. This Evelyn and Lambie, Evelyn and Leon Lambert, and
Yeah.
their daughter Mina. They moved up the street to Yates Avenue, and then Celia, the grandmother, still lived in the Coops.
Okay, I see.
She still lived in the Coops for the rest of her life, but
Yeah.
they moved out. But I mean, I don't remember. But that was when I was a kid, so I don't know. I don't know that it was part of that movement or just that they wanted to have a house, rather than an apartment.
For sure. I mean, Brenda, of course, would have been more tuned into
Absolutely
what with adults, but she mentioned Co-op City as one of the main pools.
See, and I went to junior high school and high school with people from Co-op City because that's when that kind of happened. Because I was in junior high school I guess I graduated from junior high school in 1973, went to high school in 73. So that was around when that was all happening. But the kids that I knew and I was friends with or classmates with from Co-op City had moved from other places. They weren't from the Coops. I don't remember. I mean, I'm sure it happened, but I don't remember my neighbors moving there. I remember people coming from, like, one girl I was friends with had come from, I want to say Rockaway, but they had come from like other parts of the city. To live in Co-op City. And then my cousin Tyke, who is my Uncle Dick's son, he and his children lived in Co-op City. I'm trying to think, did Tyke live in the Coops before he lived in Co-op City? I don't even remember. I just remember where his parents lived, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't remember where he was living before he got the apartment in Co-op City, but he and his children and his wife at the time did she live there with them? I don't know. That's a whole other family story. But but he and his children certainly, and maybe their mother, lived in Co-op City. Sonny is correct. Sonny, yes. Tyke was Richard and Sonny was Sonia.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Both. And they have four daughters, and they lived in Co-op City. But I'm not sure whether he and Sonny were here in this area before they lived over there.
Yeah. And what about let's see, some other questions here about the Coops. So by the time you were a child and teenager, were there many people who claimed to be communist anymore in the Coops?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent.
Sure.
There was this guy. His name was Alberto Moreau. He was Basque, I believe.
Okay. Yeah.
And he was kind of like one of these elder statesmen. People used to go to him and ask him like questions. If I do so-and-so, am I being bourgeois? And they would ask him for a ruling. I don't know what gave him this position in the neighborhood, maybe because he was older or what, but it was so funny, like, because my mother, I remember talking to him. I mean, it was probably before I was born, but I'm sorry, can you hold on 1 second, Steven?
Yeah, sure.
I don't understand what that means. Oh, go ahead. Okay. Somebody's going to walk by.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
He's not going to see you, hon. Just go straight there. Because the camera's like directly in this direction. You can't see anybody walking by. I promise you.
Yeah.
Right? You don't even see anybody walking by, right?
Yeah, it's true. And okay. If
I'm in my bedroom. My partner just woke up. Sure. She wanted to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And she didn't want to like walk into our shot. But you can't see anything beyond, the camera range is right here. It's just the laptop and you can't see anybody walking by. See, if I put my hand here, you don't even see my hand.
And okay. I can always cut her out too.
I mean, she just didn't want to.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there was this guy. His name was Alberto Moreau, and my mother used to be very upset, and I guess it still went on when I was a kid because I remember hearing about it. But my mother would get really angry. She would get really pissed off because a lot of the white ladies in the neighborhood would make a big fuss over my father. And my father was a handsome guy, but he
Mm,
was also one of the few black men in the neighborhood.
yeah.
And they would come over and they'd be like, "Oh, Bill," and they would like
Oh my
hug him and kiss him. And my mother would get like really angry.
yeah.
And she was like, first of all, let's face it, like in retrospect, they're fetishizing him because
Oh,
he's like,
absolutely.
he's a minority. He's uh, uh, an example of somebody who's not represented greatly in the area. So
Yeah.
I mean, that's what that was. But also, it's like they were showing off how like egalitarian they were by you know being friendly with this black guy.
Yeah.
And my mother would get angry because she's like, that's my husband. Stop kissing on my husband. Stop
Yeah.
touching him. And what is your problem?
For sure.
And some of these people told my mother that she was being very like narrow-minded and very bourgeois. And so she's like asked Alberto, and she's like, no, they're the ones with the problem. Tell them to cut it out. Like, you're not doing anything wrong. But I mean, they would try to use doctrine to
Absolutely.
to justify their behavior. And she's like,
Absolutely.
this is ridiculous. You
Crazy.
people are full of crap.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I
Uh,
mean, I do remember hearing about that. I don't remember that I ever saw it, but I remember it made my mother very angry.
yeah.
But as far as like, so I mean, there was a certain amount of people who were still calling themselves communist. And,
Yeah.
I mean, I think at that point, by the time I was a child, a lot of the uh, energy as far as politics and stuff was going into like um, civil rights stuff,
Absolutely.
segregation, voting stuff, and just people getting hired places, and all that whole movement.
Yeah, yeah. And your parents were hooked into those channels as well.
Oh, for sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it's a matter of debate because we went to DC like when there were marches and stuff, and you know we can't agree whether I was at the famous March on Washington, the, I have a dream, whatever. I
Yeah.
might have been there. I don't
Yeah.
know. I would have been
Yeah.
like 4 years old.
Too
So
young to
I don't
remember.
remember.
Yeah.
But I do remember getting up. We used to go, we'd get up, and it was like, to me, it seemed like the crack of dawn. I don't know. I was a little kid.
Yeah.
And we would go on the corner of Owenville and Allerton was a candy store, a luncheonette. And we would go and we would meet there, and we would get on a bus. Sometimes we drove. At some point we had a car, but we
Yeah.
would get on a bus and go down to DC for demonstrations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember like we had to go really early in the morning, and it was chilly and it was dark. And we would get on these buses and go down to DC.
Were the buses owned by Buddy's company or
I don't think Buddy had any well, I don't even know.
yeah.
I don't know. At one point, my father and my uncle Buddy were thinking of going into business, moving to Hawaii and going into business.
Huh.
This was before I was born. And
Yeah.
my mother's like, "What the heck am I going to do in Hawaii?" I'm an opera singer, and
Yeah.
so I missed out on being born in Hawaii, alas. But yeah, but I mean, I don't remember. I don't remember what buses my uncle Buddy had and didn't have. I guess he did have buses, but I
Yeah.
have a feeling this was something that was organized either by some organization that my parents were in,
Sure.
or possibly by my father's union.
Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
That they would have buses that would say like, okay, we're going to send a contingent of people from the Bronx and a contingent of people from Manhattan or
Yeah.
whatever, and they would have one in like each area. I don't recall. I was little.
Yeah. For sure. For sure. Do you remember any other civil rights protests or pickets around the Bronx when you were little, besides the White Castle one?
I don't. I really don't.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I
Oh
don't.
no, that's fine. You don't need to apologize. I mean, it's uh, the White Castle one was definitely the most publicized. And before White Castle, there were various things, with Parkchester, but that went on for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think 1968 was the first year they allowed uh, any non-white families to move in, but
Into
there were
Barchester.
picketing
Mm,
Parkchester back in the 40s, even in the Bronx. So, um,
interesting.
but yeah, what about at the point you were a child and teenager? Do you remember any uh, famous Black radicals coming around the Coops at all?
Um, I know, I don't know about calling around the Coops. I know that my parents met like certain people, like they met, um, oh, this is an embarrassing story about my mother. I shouldn't even tell you. But they met like Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah,
times at things because they lived in the Bronx at one point. I know that they lived in New Rochelle.
that's right.
And they actually went to the same medical practice that we did, that we used to belong to HIP, which was
Oh,
at like Montefiore Hospital.
yeah, yeah.
And my mother, for some reason, she had met Ossie Davis more than once, my mother, and she was in the elevator with him, and she was like, "Oh, I'm so pleased to see you. We see all your movies, and we really like your work and your wife, Ruby Dee, and it's such an honor to see you, Mr. Poitier." Yes. So you
Oh God.
realize what she said afterwards.
Oh my God.
So then my father was at some sort of rally or something like a few years later, and he was there.
Oh wow.
Ossie
Yeah.
Davis was there. And my mother said, well, at least thank goodness after all these years, he doesn't remember that incident. And my father said, oh, yeah, he does.
Oh, that's mortifying.
um, oh, you know who used to be around here? Do you know who Queen Mother Moore is?
Absolutely. I was going to ask you about her. Yeah.
She is the woman who looked at my sister, Sharon, in the stroller and said to my father, where'd you get that white baby?
That sounds that sounds in keeping with yeah, yeah.
So she was around.
y-
She's somebody I heard of. I heard
yeah.
some
She spent
stories about her.
most of her time in Harlem. She would pretty
Mhm,
much just use the Bronx to sleep and eat in,
mhm,
as far as I know. I mean, that's what her son, who's 90 years old, is
mhm.
still around. That's what he says anyway.
But I mean, my aunt Angie and my father knew her.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as other people, I don't I don't remember.
Yeah. I think the
They-
fifth I
Probably I
think
get off the
the
phone with you and I'll be like, oh yeah, there was that other guy.
50s. Yeah, yeah. I know that at least from what Charlotte remembers, of course, Paul Robeson would come around sometimes. She
Mhm.
remembers William and Lou Patterson coming around sometimes.
Oh gosh, no, my father was friends with Bill Patterson.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I wasn't even thinking about them. And
Yeah,
and their daughter is still in New York, Mary Lou.
yeah, yeah, she is.
She's a
Yeah, I think she
doctor.
lives in Brooklyn still. Or
She's a doctor. She went to medical school in Cuba.
yeah, yeah.
No, my father was actually very good friends with Bill Patterson, as a
Okay.
matter of fact.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. Um, so they would come to your apartment then too. They'd probably come
I'm
in.
sure they did. I
Yeah,
don't remember well, but I mean, I certainly remember the names, and I
yeah.
remember them. Yeah.
And Charlotte thinks that Dr. Du Bois came to their apartment.
That I would have remembered hearing
Yeah,
about.
I mean,
No, I
'cause
didn't know
he
that.
he was.
Wow.
I think he would have moved to Ghana pretty shortly after you were born, within
Hmm.
a few years. That's where he died too.
Right.
But yeah, I imagine, if Charlotte remembers correctly, it probably would have been in the early 50s or so.
Right.
And then Henry Winston uh, apparently went underground at the Coops when he was on the
Henry
run.
Winston, Judy Winston's father.
Uh, I I'm not sure of his children's names, but maybe, yeah, because I know the Winstons
Because
lived in the
Judy
Coops.
was friends with my sister, friends with other people that I was friends with. She's now Judy Rosansky.
Judy
She got
Rosansky.
married. Yeah, but
Yeah, so
if yeah, Judy Winston. I mean, I grew up with her. I mean, again, a little older than me, but
yeah, and that must be her, because he and his wife and children lived in the Coops while he was hiding from the FBI.
mhm. I
And
wasn't even thinking about them. Yeah.
he eventually turned himself in,
Hmm.
um, but yeah, those are the names that I've heard so far. And then of course, we have uh, your father, who I really wish I could have met. He sounds like he was a rabble rouser as much as
He
Angie
was. He
was.
was. The thing is funny is he was a rabble rouser, but he was generally a very like quiet, calm, even-tempered person. He
Yeah,
just did not believe in taking crap from people. He did not
Sure.
believe in letting people get away with stuff. And that thing with the cop, I mean, when he told me that story, I just so admire that, you know.
Absolutely. Me too. Just, yeah, a directness
But
about.
I mean, he would, it's funny because we were talking about something once about people coming to like keep people under surveillance or to cause trouble at demonstrations or something. And he like mentioned in passing about what the most effective way to slash a tire is. And I was like, really? But it was just like in
Yeah.
passing. Oh yeah, you
Yeah.
got to do it this way. You can't do that. I was like, wow,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. 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 But yeah, you've shared so much already, and I think we could probably easily talk for another 2 hours, but I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll go ahead and ask you about Angie at this point, to start winding things down. What do you remember about Angie?
I remember Angie calling me when she wanted me to do household chores for her. Honestly,
The
I washed her
inside family
laundry
perspective
and
here.
went to
Yeah.
the grocery store for her more times than I can count,
Yep.
and received many critiques on my technique of carrying out said tasks.
Yep.
She was a
Sounds
very
like family.
demanding individual.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Um, that's but I remember her entertaining. I remember her cooking. She was a really good cook. She liked to have people in her house. I remember she and my father, and I'm trying to think if Buddy was one of the bridge players. I guess no, Imogene, my Aunt Imogene,
Okay.
her
Yeah.
sister, and their friend Christine. I can't remember Christine's last name. She lived in New Haven, Connecticut, or
Mm,
thereabouts, and they would play bridge together. And so they would have the way the apartment was. It was originally a professional apartment, so it was kind of big, and the living room had another room that adjoined it that
okay.
they
Yeah.
used as kind of, I don't know what, they had a stereo in there and whatever, and they would be in the other room with the bridge table playing bridge, and she would have people over to play bridge a lot. And my father tried to teach me, but I opted out because he
Same
was trying to
here.
teach me, and I said, Dad, so if I learn to play bridge, if I get to be good enough, will I be playing like with you and your sisters? And he said, yeah. I said, so one day I'll be playing and I'll make a really bad bid. I'll do something stupid. And then my Aunt Imogene will kick me really hard under the table and not speak to me for the next 2 days. And he said, yeah. And I said, okay,
No, thank
I'm
you.
out. Forget it. Not interested anymore. But I mean, I remember them entertaining in that apartment a lot. And I'm sure there were lots of these great intellectual lights were coming around, but I don't remember because I was little.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, do you remember any uh, specific like vivid memories of Angie? Things that stick out?
Not really. I mean, I remember her getting like different honorary degrees and getting invited places and going to different countries. And I remember when
Yeah.
she went to the Gambia, and she went to some other places in Africa. But specifics, no,
Sure. Sure.
really. I mean, she was my aunt. I don't know.
Yeah. Exactly.
I
Exactly.
remember going to her house and eating meals and
Yeah.
talking to her about mundane things.
Absolutely.
The one thing I wish I could find, and if I find it, I will pass it on to you. I might have it somewhere in this apartment. Was she ran for, was it state assembly at one
Uh,
point?
State Senate.
State Senate. Okay.
Yeah.
And she
Yeah.
ran on the ticket with Vito Marcantonio.
Yeah.
And
1949.
somewhere in my apartment, my sister had, and I found one of her flyers
Wow.
somewhere, but I don't know where it is.
Yeah. 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 If you find that,
But
let
I
me.
remember, it was like it had points about how landlords must not discriminate against Negro,
Yeah.
Puerto Rican, and Italian tenants,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something to that effect.
Yeah. For sure.
But I probably shouldn't even have brought it up. It's around here someplace.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I spoke. So I interviewed Charlotte back in August, but we've been speaking or corresponding since then. And just the other day, I was speaking with her, and she mentioned that she remembered seeing probably that flyer hung up on Fordham Road when she was a child It
Oh,
eventually
really?
disappeared, but it was a campaign flyer for, her mom. Um, and yeah, she remembers seeing them still when she was growing up, probably no one took them down for a few years or
Mhm.
something, um, but yeah, yeah, I'm trying to hunt down any recordings I can of Angie as well. There's a couple in New York at the various New York Public Library branches that I am waiting for the pandemic to end so I can
Mhm.
actually retrieve them and transcribe them and all. Um, but yeah, it's definitely hard to locate traces of her, as much of a presence as she was in various organizations. It's still,
Well, I think a lot of people weren't really thinking about preserving things at that
yeah,
time. I mean, even if you look at like commercially produced like TV shows and movies and stuff, people were destroying stuff left and right, recording over it, not recording things. It's like, what were you thinking? But I don't think that at that time we were aware of how interesting and how precious those things would be to people years later.
yeah, yeah. And I'm guessing the same thing with your father. It's probably hard uh, to find many recordings or anything of him at
Mhm.
this point. Huh?
I have like a couple of pictures, and
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen that picture of my, well, maybe you haven't, but I'm pretty sure that Charlotte has a copy of it, a picture of my father and his siblings and his parents from when
Oh,
he was little.
she hasn't showed that to me. No.
Oh, well, I've got it hanging on my wall. I mean, I'd be very happy to somehow get you a copy of it. My printer scanner thing is not working at the moment, but
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. It'd be great to see
I mean,
that.
that was before they moved here because they
Yeah,
were children, but
sure. Um,
it's,
but yeah, because I mean, it sounds like it sounds like it'd be just as worthwhile to try to find any recordings that I can of your father as well. I'm really trying to kind of gather up sources for, primary sources for uh, the study of Black liberation in the Bronx.
mhm,
You know, hopefully for high schools, college students. I'd like to
interesting.
publish a collection at some point. I
I
mean,
wish I had more stuff. I wish my particular branch of the family was better about saving things, but honestly,
no, I understand. I understand
and
completely.
then at some point, my mom went into a nursing home, and I was not in an emotional state, unfortunately, to collect some of her belongings, which
Sure.
means that I've lost some family photographs,
Oh yeah, I
unfortunately.
understand that. I understand that completely.
The picture of us with our Freedom Now buttons, stuff like that.
Yeah. Um, and uh, again, I want to make sure that you get to do what you need to do before work. But just a couple more questions that came up
Hmm.
in from my conversation with Charlotte. She remembers two women that I've been trying to find out more information about. And I'm not sure if you might remember them or not. One is
Hmm.
Jill Goldstein, um,
Doesn't ring a bell.
and the other is Florence Holman.
That name sounds familiar, but I don't. Sorry.
No, that's fine. You don't need to apologize at all. You've already
That name is very, very familiar.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's crazy because I mean, you'd think with the internet and the amount of records that have been digitized, that you could at least find a trace of someone if you had a name. But
Hmm.
with with those two women in particular, I mean, Jill Goldstein's hard enough because uh, you know,
It's a pretty
the,
common name.
in the Bronx alone, there's
Yes, exactly.
um, but yeah, I've been able to find out a little bit about Jill because there's a couple other people who remember her, but Florence Holman has been more difficult.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's all I got, at least that occurs to me at the moment. I mean, when these interviews end, I always think, oh, why didn't I ask this question, or why didn't I ask them to say more about this particular thing? But
Hey, you have my email address.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, do you have anything else you'd like to add, or anything that
Nothing
occurs
that
to you?
I can think of offhand, but as you say, probably when we finish, I'll think of something or somebody, or I
Absolutely.
don't know. Can't think of
Yeah.
anything offhand.
And are there any do you know if there's anyone else who lives in the Coops, who's lived in the Coops a long time like yourself, or off and on like yourself?
Um, Not that I can think of offhand, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm a New Yorker. I don't talk to my neighbors. I'm
I
teasing,
get that.
but seriously, I can't think of anybody. I mean, because if you think of it, I mean, I'm 60, so people my age and older. I mean, a lot of those people, if they haven't moved, they've died.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, we're
yeah.
not talking about like young people.
Absolutely.
Um, Offhand, cannot.
Sure.
I cannot. Um, I mentioned, like you mentioned, the Winston family. I mean, Judy and Walter, her husband. I'm not even sure where they live, but they're somewhere upstate, not upstate to a New Yorker. Like
I
someplace like
know.
maybe in Westchester or Orange County or
Westchester.
something.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
But or Rockland. I'm not sure exactly where, but
Something like that.
somewhere thereabouts. But it might be possible to get a hold of it. I mean, are you looking specifically for Black families, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm
I do
interviewing.
actually have a friend who's older than I am, who's been living here for a long time,
Oh yeah.
but she is not Black. She is white.
Oh, I mean, I'm interviewing a handful of the older white residents as well, just to
I mean, I could ask her if she's interested. I don't know if you've heard Joellen Squelia, who was actually, she was, what's her maiden name? Eisenman, I think.
Oh, okay.
But
No, I haven't heard.
she's been living in the Coops at least since I was a little kid. I'm pretty sure she lived here when she was a child, and
Oh
she's
wow.
like about 70 something.
Yeah. No, I definitely
So
appreciate getting
she
in touch.
might be somebody to talk to. I mean, sure, she remembers things long before I do.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Um,
she's been, and then her daughter has been living in the Coops her whole life, I think.
oh wow.
So, but they're in the neighborhood, and I'm
Okay.
good friends with her.
Yeah, yeah, no,
So if you
I
were
appreciate
interested
that.
in getting in touch with Joe, I could maybe give her your information and see
Yeah.
if she's interested.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be
hmm
great. For
But
sure.
that's the only person I can't believe she didn't come to mind immediately.
Yeah, yeah.
But she is a long time resident, and she's really interested in, she's like in all the Facebook groups of the junior high school and
Sure,
stuff like that. So I think
sure.
she has a lot of, she might have some pictures of some people who are interested in her, but she has a lot of pictures of her family and stuff like that. A
Oh wow.
lot.
Wow, wow.
So maybe she would be a good resource for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd really appreciate that. Um,
Okay, I will send her a text or give her a phone call and just give her your email address and stuff
yeah,
like that.
yeah, that's good.
Okay.
That's good. But yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to share all of your memories because even if you might not have thought it, you had so much to share and a lot of very valuable information too. So,
Cool.
um,
And if I
so
come across anything else, and if I can get my scanner to work, I will send you a picture of that. I will send you a copy of that photograph.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and somewhere, I think somewhere in here also, because it was Lori's mother, somewhere here I have a picture of my father with his first wife.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, yeah.
Somewhere. So I'll see, if I can hunt those things up. That might be useful to you.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, great. Thank you so much.
My
And
pleasure. It was nice talking to you.
yeah, nice talking to you too. Nice meeting you electronically. And let's hope and by this point next year we'll live in a little less of a terrifying world
Yes, let's hope so on many fronts. That
on
it's a
many
less
fronts.
terrifying world.
Absolutely,
Sometimes
absolutely.
I wish my parents were around to see it, and sometimes I think I'm really, they went through enough of this crap
No, I know.
already. You know,
Absolutely, absolutely.
we've been
On
through
both sides,
we've
you
been through
know.
all this like fascism and stuff.
Yeah,
Previously.
the, the American form of fascism and the German form of fascism.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway,
Well,
so On that cheerful note,
Cheerful. Well, you take care. You have a good day.
you too. And if I think of any, amusing anecdotes or insights or whatever, I'll send you an email.
Yeah, yeah, because we can always do this again, if you want. Depending
I don't
on.
know how much more there is, but I'm saying if something pops up like, oh yeah, I met so and so
Yeah,
and
yeah. Send it
whatever,
along.
or I have a picture of something, or I'm sorry, my cat is running around being silly.
I have one of those crazy cats too.
She just decided to have zoomies all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but if I think of anything, I'll let you know. What I'll do is I'm not saying I guarantee that she'll be interested, but knowing Joe, she probably would be. So just keep an eye out. Her name is Joellen Squelia,
Okay.
and I will give her your contact information. As I said, she's lived here. She probably lived here her whole life. And as I said, she's older than I am. So she probably remembers things and has pictures of people. You never know.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, great. Thank you so much, and you take care.
Okay, you too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.